Hey there, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments.
They say that family gatherings bring out the best and worst in people, but I've always believed they just shine a spotlight on the roles we've been forced to play our whole lives. Some wear their masks better than others. Some of us got tired of pretending, and some of us, well, we bring receipts. It was one of those evenings that tried too hard to be perfect. You know the kind: low jazz humming from overpriced speakers, waiters in bow ties serving shrimp cocktail nobody really touches. A room full of people who'd all rather be checking their phones than clapping for someone's carefully polished legacy. My dad's retirement party was exactly that. Roger Miller, district manager turned regional director, 52 years in the same company, the kind of man who ironed his socks and shook hands like every grip was a business deal. He stood in the center of the room that night, holding a crystal glass like it was a damn Olympic torch, basking in the applause that followed a 3-minute highlight reel full of stock photos, golf outings, and fake smiles from coworkers who'd probably already deleted him from their phones. I stood near the back, next to the buffet table where the crab cakes had begun to sweat. I'd picked a dress that blended into the beige walls on purpose, something that said, "I'm here, but not for you." I watched as my brother Chris, all 6'2" of him, with that perfect tie and that annoying way of making every room feel like his stage, stood beside Dad with a hand on his shoulder like some heir apparent at a coronation. It was nauseating. Then Dad raised his glass, cleared his throat, and said words I've been hearing all my life, just never quite this publicly. "Before we wrap this up," he began, already a few bourbons in, "I want to thank my wonderful wife, Carol, for putting up with me all these years. God knows I wasn't easy." Laughter followed, forced and thin. Mom smiled like she always did, tight-lipped and exhausted. "And I want to thank my 2 kids," he went on, pausing like he was about to say something profound. I felt the air shift, the way it does before a storm. "Chris, my boy, my pride. I couldn't be more proud of the man you've become. Your work ethic, your success, the way you handle yourself. It's everything I ever hoped for when I became a father." More clapping. Chris patted his chest like a damn war hero. Then Dad's eyes drifted toward me, and I felt that familiar burn in my chest before he even opened his mouth. "And Jenna, well, not everyone takes the same path, but if only both my kids had been as successful as my clan." He chuckled, just a soft one, but it echoed in my ears like a slap. There it was in front of family, friends, old co-workers, and a handful of strangers sipping white wine. My father had once again boiled my existence down to a polite footnote. No mention of my years in education, the kids I'd helped pull from the edge, the community work, or the freelance projects that actually paid my bills. No mention of the life I'd built without leaning on anyone. Just that old narrative he loved so much. Jenna, the weird one, the underachiever, the she-means-well daughter. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I didn't walk out. I just smiled, wide and calm, the way you do when someone punches you in the gut and you pretend you're fine. I raised my glass, took a slow sip, and let the room settle. Because I knew something Dad didn't. I had something in my pocket that could turn the entire evening on its head. See, 6 months ago I'd borrowed Chris's iPad by accident during a family visit. It was logged into his cloud. I wasn't snooping, not at first. But once I saw what was in his messages, I couldn't unsee it. I couldn't forget the voice memos, the videos, the screen recordings of things he should have kept far away from any synced device. Over time, I copied them. Quietly, deliberately. I didn't plan on using them, not until tonight. But tonight? Well, he and Dad gave me the perfect opening. So while Dad basked in the applause, I slid my phone from my purse, scrolled to a file labeled Golden Boy, and turned to my brother with a sweet little grin. He leaned toward me like I was about to offer him a joke, another laugh at my own expense. Instead, I tilted the screen toward both of them, Dad and Chris, and said just loud enough for the table to hear, "Want to see something?" His smile faltered. That was the moment everything started to shift. The air, the expressions, the weight of the room. Even Mom looked up from her untouched plate of asparagus. I tapped the screen. The video began to play. Now here's a question for you. One I've been chewing on since that night. If someone humiliates you in public, is it wrong to return the favor? And if what you reveal is the truth, nothing more, nothing less, can it even be called revenge? I'll let you decide. But I'll tell you this much. By the time the video ended, my father's face had gone completely white. And that's when the real story began. The thing about people like Chris, people who've been told from day one that the sun rises and sets with their footsteps, is that they never learn to cover their tracks. Not really, because when you've grown up being clapped for every time you tie your damn shoes, you start thinking the rules don't apply to you, that consequences are just for other people. For people like me, the ones always trying to prove we belong at the same table, even if our chairs are broken and missing a leg. Growing up in the Miller household was like living in a perfectly framed photograph, one of those glossy family portraits that hangs above the fireplace and lies through its teeth every time you look at it. On the surface, we were the image of suburban success, a 2-story house with blue shutters, a golden retriever named Max, and a backyard big enough for birthday parties and Sunday barbecues, where my father grilled steaks like he was auditioning for a cooking show, and my mother smiled like she wasn't quietly counting the hours until she could drink her Chardonnay alone. Chris, 2 years older, always played the role of the golden child with nauseating precision. Captain of the football team, prom king, full ride to college, and the kind of charisma that made teachers overlook his laziness and girls overlook his lies. Me? I was the background noise, the weird one with art supplies in my backpack, and books about space and plants and anything that didn't require applause to matter. I was too smart in the wrong ways and too quiet in all the ways that made people uncomfortable. Dad used to say, "Chris is the one who's going places, Jenna. You should stick close to your brother. He'll look out for you." But what he really meant was, don't get in his way. Stay small, stay quiet. Don't ruin the image. So I did for years. Until that afternoon in March, when I picked up what I thought was my tablet off the kitchen counter during one of those reluctant family weekends, the kind where we all pretend we enjoy each other's company for 72 hours before retreating to our corners again. I opened it to check my email, and that's when I saw the folder. Cloud synced, not locked, labeled only with a date that meant nothing to me but everything to him. Inside were videos, screenshots, recordings of phone calls, and photos that made me sit down slowly on the edge of the guest bed and stare at the screen for a long, long time. I didn't need to dig. It was all just there, laid out like a map to the real Chris Miller. There were voice memos of him laughing with a colleague about creative accounting, jokes about moving money through dummy vendors, things that sounded too rehearsed to be innocent. There were texts to a woman who was definitely not his wife, messages filled with hotel bookings, vacation plans, and photographs that were explicit enough to make even a cynic like me flinch. There were video calls saved to the cloud, probably by accident, that captured pieces of conversations where Chris bragged about how easy it was to siphon company funds into a separate account because no one questions a Miller. That night, I sat on the guest bed in a silence so thick it felt like someone had wrapped my chest in concrete. Part of me wanted to delete everything. Another part wanted to call his wife, his boss, his best friend from college, who still sent us Christmas cards like we all cared. But mostly, I just wanted to breathe. Because for the first time in years, I wasn't angry, I wasn't bitter, I wasn't the ignored daughter with the small job and the quiet life. I was someone holding the truth. And the truth, as it turns out, has a gravity of its own. Over the next few weeks, I started backing things up. I transferred files to a separate hard drive, made copies on a flash drive I kept in my sock drawer, encrypted folders on my laptop with passwords only I would know. I didn't tell anyone, not my closest friend, not even the therapist I'd been seeing since last year. It wasn't fear that kept me quiet. It was patience. The kind of patience you learn from years of swallowing your pride in exchange for peace. From hearing your name used as a punchline in your own home. From sitting through dinners where your successes are ignored and your failures become family folklore. I didn't plan for the retirement party. It just sort of aligned. But once the date was set, once the invites were sent and the country club was booked, I felt something click into place. A quiet voice inside me said, "This is the moment." Not out of revenge, not out of some dramatic need for attention, but because sometimes the truth needs to be dragged into the light, especially when it's been hiding behind a $400 tie and a perfect goddamn smile. So I started assembling the package, just enough to make a point, not enough to ruin his life outright. I told myself I was being fair, that I'd only show the video, the one where Chris talks casually about moving money into a rainy day fund while drinking scotch in what looks like his office. The one where he jokes that his clients are too dumb to notice. I edited it down, added subtitles so it couldn't be misunderstood, and named the file something innocuous. Golden Boy. Because that's what he always was. And what happens next? Well, let's just say the cracks in his golden armor were about to show. And there's nothing more satisfying than watching someone who's always stood above you finally realize that the floor beneath them isn't as solid as they thought. There's a peculiar kind of silence that settles in your chest when you realize you hold the power to completely dismantle someone's carefully constructed life. Not because you sought revenge or went digging where you weren't supposed to, but because they were too arrogant, too careless, and too convinced of their own invincibility to think anyone else might be paying attention, let alone someone like me, someone they had spent decades overlooking, brushing aside like dust on an old trophy shelf that hadn't been wiped since high school ended. The moment I discovered Chris's secrets wasn't explosive or dramatic. It was quiet, surgical almost, a slow unfolding of truth that crept into my bones and refused to leave. And what started as a few screenshots turned into a labyrinth of deceit that ran so deep I wasn't sure whether to feel sick, satisfied, or simply tired. At first, I treated it like a puzzle, clinical, removed, like some amateur detective piecing together fragments from a crime scene no one else knew existed. There were names I didn't recognize: Marina, Jess, someone saved only as Wildflower, which felt like a joke too ironic to be real. There were transfers in amounts just low enough to avoid triggering alerts, but frequent enough to paint a clear picture of intent. There were emails, God, the emails, filled with phrases like, "off the books," and "just between us," and "we'll circle back once the dummy invoice clears." The kind of language that even the most generous interpretation couldn't excuse as innocent. It was like peeling back layers of paint only to find rot underneath. And the more I uncovered, the more I began to realize that this wasn't just a case of infidelity or financial mischief. It was systemic, calculated, and worst of all, smug. Chris operated like a man who believed he'd already won, who had memorized the rules not to follow them, but to dance around them with the kind of casual elegance that comes from a lifetime of unearned praise. He wasn't panicked in those videos. He wasn't nervous in those voice memos. He was confident, too confident, and that's what made it so damning. This wasn't a man who had made a mistake in a moment of weakness. This was someone who had built an alternate life with precision, like a second set of blueprints hidden under the floorboards of his public persona. And once I saw it for what it was, I couldn't look away. I started cataloging everything with the same obsessive care I used to reserve for my classroom lesson plans. Folders labeled by month, timelines drawn out with sticky notes on my bedroom wall, connections mapped like a detective chasing a killer. I told myself it wasn't obsession, it was preparation. Because when the time came, I wouldn't just be speaking the truth, I'd be proving it, with timestamps, bank statements, recorded calls, and enough digital receipts to make even the most skeptical observer pause. Still, there were moments, late at night, where I questioned myself, where I asked what I hoped to accomplish, whether this was justice or something darker wearing its skin. But then I'd hear Dad's voice echoing in my memory. That same smug tone from 1,000 dinner conversations, where Chris was praised for achievements I knew were inflated or misattributed, where I was politely ignored or patronized with comments like, "She's got a good heart," as though that was the only value I could bring to the table. And in those moments, the doubt would evaporate, replaced by a cold clarity that made everything sharper, more focused. This wasn't just about Chris. This was about every time I was silenced, every time I was asked to step aside, every time success was defined in a way that excluded me on principle. When I finally compiled the main video, the one I would eventually show at the retirement party, it wasn't rage I felt. It was something more precise, more potent. The footage I selected showed Chris in a video call, leaning back in his leather office chair, sipping something amber from a crystal glass, speaking to a man whose name I wouldn't learn until later. They were discussing a payment that had been rerouted through a consultancy that didn't exist, laughing about how no one in corporate will check twice as long as the reports look clean. Chris actually smirked at the camera, eyes gleaming, and said, "It's not stealing when you're the one holding the pen." I paused the frame right there, froze it on his face like a portrait of hubris. That was the clip I trimmed, subtitled, and backed up in 4 different places. That was the moment I knew exactly what I would do. The irony was almost too perfect. A man who spent his life chasing external validation, standing at a podium receiving applause from people who had no idea he was a fraud, while the daughter he dismissed as unremarkable held a digital grenade in her evening clutch. I didn't want to destroy him, not really, but I wanted him to see himself through my eyes, naked, flawed, and completely stripped of the illusion he had curated so carefully over the years. I wanted Dad to look at the son he worshipped and ask, "Who the hell is this man?" So I waited. I practiced patience the way other people practice speeches. And when the night of the retirement party finally came, when the toast started and the praise began to flow like cheap wine, I didn't flinch. I watched. I smiled. And when the moment came, when my father leaned into the microphone and cut me down with a single line about how not everyone turns out like Chris, I pulled out my phone with the calm of someone who had already won. Because sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't loud or dramatic or cruel. Sometimes it's quiet, methodical, and completely undeniable. And sometimes all it takes is one video to tear down an entire house of cards. There are moments in life when time doesn't slow down the way it does in movies. Instead, it accelerates so fiercely that your senses can barely keep up. And by the time your mind has caught onto what's happening, everything around you has already shifted, already fallen, already rearranged itself into a version of reality you didn't even know was possible. And that's exactly what happened the moment I pressed play and let the truth loose in that glossy, over-decorated banquet hall, where decades of carefully curated illusions dissolved under the glow of LED chandeliers and the unforgiving clarity of recorded sound. The video wasn't long, barely 2 minutes, but I had chosen every frame with the precision of a surgeon and the detachment of someone who'd already mourned the death of her family's narrative long ago. It opened with Chris in his office, the same one Dad had helped him furnish when he got the promotion he never earned, leaning back in that expensive leather chair like a man who thought the world owed him comfort. The audio was crystal clear, every syllable, every arrogant laugh, every reference to creative reallocations and off-the-books bonuses landed with the weight of a confession. And then, as if fate had written the script herself, the kicker, Chris swirling the last of his drink, leaning forward and muttering, "It's not stealing when the numbers dance for you." A line so soaked in smugness it could have been tattooed on his soul. The silence that followed was immediate, vast, and electric. One of those silences that feels almost physical, like someone cracked open the windows in a soundproof room and let the outside world rush in. People didn't gasp or shout. They just stared, some mouths slightly open, others frozen mid-bite, forks suspended in mid-air like they'd been paused by a director off-screen. My mother's face went pale before the video even reached the halfway mark, and by the end, she had stopped blinking altogether, hands folded in her lap as if in prayer, except there was no one left to pray to. My father, on the other hand, didn't react the way I thought he would. I'd imagined outrage, disbelief, maybe even denial, a righteous explosion of the sort only a man like him could deliver. The kind that would echo across generations of barbecues and fishing trips and end in someone flipping a table. But instead, what I saw was worse. He stared at the screen like a man watching his own house burn down from the front porch. Too proud to run, too stunned to move. His eyes, once so sharp and commanding, darted across the screen trying to find something, anything, that would make it stop being real. But it was real. And it wasn't going away. Chris, to his credit, didn't flinch right away. He stood there with his usual plastic smile, frozen for a second, as if his brain had disconnected from his face and left it behind. But as the silence thickened, as the murmurs began to ripple across the room like waves in a shallow pool, that smile faltered. His jaw twitched. His hand, which had been resting confidently on the back of Dad's chair, dropped to his side, fingers curling slightly as if to grip something invisible, some last shred of control, some unspoken defense that never quite made it to his lips. When he finally looked at me, it wasn't anger in his eyes. It was confusion, as if he couldn't quite process the fact that someone like me, someone he'd written off 1,000 times, had been capable of such precision. And in that split second, I felt something I didn't expect. Not triumph, not satisfaction, but a strange, hollow kind of sorrow. Because no matter how far he had fallen in my eyes, no matter how much of a fraud I knew he was still my brother, still the boy who once gave me the last slice of pizza when I cried after losing my hamster. Still the teenager who let me sneak into his room to watch scary movies when our parents were fighting downstairs. But that boy was long gone, replaced by a man who thought success meant stepping on necks while keeping your shoes clean, who thought family loyalty was owed to him by default but never earned or returned. The video ended. The silence lingered. And then, finally, my father stood up. He didn't yell. He didn't gesture. He didn't ask a single question. He just pushed his chair back with a quiet scrape that somehow cut through the noise louder than any shout ever could, turned to Chris with a look so sharp it could have carved marble, and said just one word, flat, final, and devastating. Get out. Chris didn't move at first. It was like he hadn't heard it. Or maybe he had, but he couldn't believe it. Couldn't believe that the same man who'd bent over backward to excuse his mistakes, who'd defended him at every turn, who'd spent a lifetime polishing his image like a damn trophy, was now turning him into a stranger in front of everyone. Dad, he began, but Dad held up a hand. You heard me. It wasn't anger in his voice. It was something colder, something closer to grief. Chris looked around the room, searching for a lifeline, but none came. His wife had already gathered her purse and was making her way toward the exit, face blank. Mom still hadn't moved. And me, I just stood there, calm, composed, watching the mask slip inch by inch until all that was left was a man who no longer knew who he was without it. He left in silence, no apology, no denial, no final word to save face. And as the door shut behind him, I realized the power of truth wasn't in its volume, but in its timing. And this time, for once in my life, I had picked exactly the right moment. But what came next? That was something I wasn't quite prepared for. Because even when you think you've won, even when the truth is on your side, even when the applause fades and the villain exits the stage, there's always a cost waiting quietly in the wings. And mine was just beginning. The days that followed were not what I imagined. Not a parade of vindication or peace, or even quiet satisfaction, but something far more complicated, more uncomfortable, and more revealing than any imagined version of victory I had played over in my mind. While preparing the video that had, in many ways, reset the axis of my entire family. If I had expected relief, I didn't find it. If I had expected justice to feel pure, untainted by bitterness or doubt, I was mistaken. And if I thought for even a moment that the truth would simply set us free, I quickly realized that truth, when weaponized, doesn't liberate. It devastates, flattens, levels the field in a way that leaves no winners, only survivors. Chris disappeared after the party, not just from the country club, but from every digital and physical corner of our lives. His phone was disconnected within 24 hours. His email bounced replies. and even his LinkedIn page vanished as if he had never existed within the professional world our father so proudly boasted about. His wife filed for separation within the week, and I heard through one of Mom's garden club acquaintances that Chris's company had placed him on indefinite leave pending an internal investigation, which is corporate speak for, "We know exactly what you did, and we're figuring out how to erase your name without taking too much damage ourselves." For a while, I thought that would be enough, that watching the facade crack and crumble and fall would offer some closure, some long overdue reckoning that would finally balance the scales. After years of playing second or third, or sometimes no fiddle at all. But what I didn't count on, what no one really prepares you for when you speak the truth after decades of silence, is the way people retreat. The way they blame the messenger, not overtly, not always with words, but with glances, with distance, with a coolness that wraps itself around every interaction like a thin, suffocating film of discomfort. My father, despite being the one who cast Chris out with such finality, refused to speak to me for nearly a month afterward. He didn't yell, didn't accuse, didn't ask why or how or what came next. He just stopped engaging, like a machine that had been unplugged and left to rust in a corner. And when I called or visited, he would nod, offer pleasantries, but never venture beyond the surface of small talk, as though acknowledging the deeper layers of what had happened would be to admit that his entire framework for understanding success, family, and love had been built on a foundation that never really existed. My mother, always the quiet presence behind Dad's thunder, oscillated between brittle gratitude and barely veiled sorrow. She once touched my arm while we stood in the kitchen, her voice low and uneven, and said, "You did what was right, Jenna. You really did." But her eyes betrayed her, full of something else entirely. Not blame, not quite, but loss, the kind that lingers when you realize the story you've told yourself about your family no longer fits inside your skin. It wasn't that she thought I was wrong. It was that she hadn't been ready for the truth. And once it arrived, it burned down more than just the myth of her son. It scorched the edges of everything she thought she knew about how love and loyalty were supposed to operate within four walls and a shared last name. And me? I kept going. I returned to work, taught my classes, graded papers, mentored students who didn't know or care that my brother's face had once been on the cover of a financial magazine and was now a silent specter behind every unspoken conversation at family dinners. I volunteered, I hiked, I journaled, and I tried, with varying degrees of success, to remind myself that the weight of speaking up doesn't disappear just because you were right. Sometimes it grows heavier in the aftermath, a constant reminder that being right doesn't mean being loved, and being honest doesn't guarantee redemption. Then one rainy afternoon in late spring, I received a message from an unknown number. No greeting, no name, just a line of text. "You always were better at seeing people for who they really are." It was Chris. I didn't need confirmation. The phrasing, the tone, the strange mix of condescension and resignation. It was him, through and through. I stared at the message for what felt like an hour, my thumb hovering over the screen, torn between curiosity, fury, and an overwhelming sadness that had been building in my chest, like sediment layer by layer, since the night of the party. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Not because I had nothing to say, but because saying anything would reopen a wound I had only just begun to stop pressing against. But I've thought about that message ever since. I've turned it over in my mind during long drives and sleepless nights, during Sunday mornings when the house is too quiet, and I find myself wondering how many versions of our family exist in parallel universes. Ones where Chris made different choices, or where Dad listened more carefully, or where I stayed silent and let the illusion live a little longer. I wonder if I would have been happier in any of them. I wonder if the cost of honesty is always this high. And I think about success, how it's defined, who gets to define it, and whether I ever really wanted it in the form my father cherished so much. Because when I look at my life now, stripped of comparison and expectation, What I see is not a mirror of what they wanted, but something else entirely. A path carved not from applause or promotion, but from integrity, grit, and the stubborn refusal to disappear. Maybe I didn't destroy the illusion. Maybe I just burned it down so that something real could finally take root. Or maybe, and this thought lingers like a shadow, maybe I just became the villain in my own story, the one who ruined everything under the guise of truth, who mistook vindication for justice and lost something irreplaceable in the process. Either way, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with consequence. And I'm still learning how to live inside it.